In the bustling town of Agbara, where the air buzzed with activity and prosperity, the Adebanjo family stood as a beacon of success. Jide Adebanjo, a charismatic and wealthy businessman in his late 40s, had built his fortune brick by brick. His construction empire was synonymous with excellence, and his name commanded respect in every corner of the town. People admired him for his work ethic and sharp business acumen, often holding him up as a role model. Beside him was Said, his wife of 20 years. With her graceful poise, Said embodied the perfect wife and mother. She was admired for her philanthropic work, often organizing charity drives and supporting the less fortunate in the community. Her warm smile and calm demeanor earned her the nickname the Angel of Agbara. Together, Jide and Said presented the image of an ideal couple, wealthy, successful, and deeply admired. Their two children, 17-year-old Ayo and 13-year-old Tini, completed the picture-perfect family. Ayo, handsome and full of potential, was expected to follow in his father's footsteps. Tini, a bright and creative young girl, often charmed everyone she met with her wit and artistic talent. The family's mansion, surrounded by fragrant gardens and guarded by high walls, was a symbol of their success, a place that seemed untouchable. But behind those grand walls, the Adebanjo household was a house of secrets. Jide, beneath his polished exterior, was a man consumed by control and a deep desire for dominance. His booming voice often filled the mansion, turning the atmosphere tense and unwelcoming. He demanded unwavering obedience from everyone around him. Any slight deviation from his expectations was met with anger, which left his wife and children walking on eggshells. Said bore the brunt of Jide's temper. Over the years, his words had cut her down, turning her vibrant personality into a shadow of its former self. But she wore her public persona with grace. The weight of emotional and verbal abuse weighed heavily on her heart. She often retreated into moments of quiet solitude, questioning how her once dreamy marriage had turned into a gilded cage. Ayo, once a cheerful and ambitious boy, had begun to reflect his father's fiery temper. Frustrated with the constant pressure and lack of understanding, he lashed out, often clashing with Jide. Their relationship had grown combative, with each confrontation deepening the rift between them. Tini, the youngest, lived in the shadow of her family's discord. While her brother argued and her parents fought, Tini retreated into her books and music, finding solace in stories and melodies that offered an escape from the chaos. Her small acts of rebellion, doodling on the walls of her room or staying up late to write poems, were her way of carving out a piece of the world she could control. To the outside world, the Adebanjos appeared blessed, their lives envied by many. But within the confines of their mansion, the family was crumbling and the illusion of perfection was growing harder to maintain. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over one evening during dinner. The family gathered around the long mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a chandelier. The air was heavy with unspoken frustrations, and the clinking of cutlery against plates did little to mask the discomfort. Jide's sharp gaze fell on Ayo, who had been picking at his food. "Ayo," Jide began, his tone already tinged with impatience. "Your school called today. They're concerned about your grades." Ayo stiffened, his fork freezing midair. "I'm handling it," he mumbled without looking up. "Handling it?" Jide's voice rose. "Your grades are a disgrace. You're supposed to be preparing for university, not wasting your time on nonsense." Ayo clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "Maybe if you cared about what I wanted instead of your stupid plans for my life, I'd actually try harder." He shot back, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. The room fell silent. Tenny stared at her brother, her wide eyes darting nervously between him and their father. Said reached for Jide's hand in an attempt to calm him, but he yanked it away, his temper flaring. "This is your fault, Said," Jide barked, turning his anger toward her. "You've coddled him too much. You've let him grow lazy and disrespectful." Said's heart sank as she met Jide's furious gaze. She wanted to defend herself, to remind him of the countless sacrifices she had made for their family, but she knew better than to argue with him in front of the children. "Jide, please," she said softly, her voice trembling. Unable to take it any longer, Ayo pushed his chair back with a screech and stormed out of the dining room. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the mansion. Tini shrank into her chair, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Said reached out to her daughter, wrapping her in a protective embrace. "It's okay, my love," Said murmured, though the words felt hollow. "Everything will be okay." But as she sat there, comforting her frightened daughter, Said couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in her heart. The cracks in her marriage, long ignored and carefully hidden, were becoming impossible to overlook. The life she had worked so hard to build felt as though it was teetering on the edge of collapse. In the silence that followed, Jide sat back in his chair, his face a mask of anger and frustration. Said glanced at him, wondering if he felt the same turmoil she did, but his hardened expression gave nothing away. Later that night, as she tucked Teeny into bed, Said sat on the edge of her daughter's mattress, stroking her hair as the child drifted off to sleep. Her mind raced with questions she had avoided for years. How had their family come to this? Was it too late to repair the damage? Said knew she had to make a choice. She could continue to endure the facade of perfection, or she could find a way to confront the truth and protect her children from the toxicity that threatened to consume them all. But for now, she sat in the quiet of Teeny's room, the weight of her doubts pressing down on her as she clung to the hope that things could still change. Said's unease, which had simmered beneath the surface for years, took a sharp turn one quiet night. She had always been accustomed to Jide's unpredictable temper and his need for control. But his recent behavior had grown increasingly suspicious. The man who once shared every detail of his life now seemed to live in a world apart, cloaked in secrecy. That night, as she lay awake in the darkened bedroom, the faint sound of Jide's voice drifted in from the living room. Said sat up slowly, her heart pounding. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. "Don't call me this late again," Jide hissed, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to carry his frustration. "I've told you need to be more careful. Do you understand?" The line went silent as he ended the call abruptly. For a moment, Said stood frozen, her mind spinning. She had long endured Jide's coldness, his emotional distance, but the tone of his conversation was something else entirely. It was the kind of secrecy that hinted at betrayal, and the thought made her stomach turn. The next morning, Jide's demeanor was as calm and composed as ever. He sipped his coffee and read the newspaper as if nothing had happened. Said studied him from across the table, searching for answers in the lines of his face, but his guarded expression revealed nothing. While Said wrestled with her growing suspicions, Ayo's behavior began to spiral out of control. Once a promising student and a leader among his peers, Ayo had become defiant and distant. He spent long hours away from home, returning late into the night with little explanation. One evening, the front door creaked open, and Ayo staggered in, his knuckles bruised and his shirt stained with blood. "What happened to you?" Said demanded, rushing to his side. Her voice was tinged with both concern and frustration. "Nothing," Ayo muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Just leave me alone." "Ayo, talk to me," she pressed, her hand reaching for his shoulder. He shrugged her off. "I said it's nothing." He snapped before retreating to his room and slamming the door. Said stood there, stunned, her hands trembling at her sides. She had always prided herself on being a nurturing mother, but the distance growing between her and Ayo felt insurmountable. The boy who used to tell her everything was now a stranger. Teeny, meanwhile, became quieter with each passing day. Once a bright and cheerful girl who filled the house with laughter, she now spent most of her time in her room, sketching in her notebook or listening to music. Said often found her sitting by the window, staring into the garden with a vacant expression. The family dynamic had shifted, and not for the better. Jide's work trips became more frequent, his absence leaving a void that only amplified the tension in the house. Ayo's rebelliousness escalated, and Teeny's withdrawal became a silent cry for help. For Said, the walls of the mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The distance between her family members was growing, and she didn't know how to bridge the gap. The unraveling of Said's life came unexpectedly on a sunny afternoon. She was folding laundry in the bedroom when her phone buzzed on the dresser. Wiping her hands on her skirt, she picked it up and unlocked the screen. A picture stared back at her. It was Jide, seated at a restaurant with a younger woman. They were laughing, their postures close, the woman's hand resting lightly on Jide's arm. Said's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the photo was a simple message: "You deserve to know the truth." Her heart raced as she sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. The image confirmed what she had been dreading for months, yet seeing it in black and white left her breathless. Who had sent the picture? And why? Questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was clear. Her suspicions were no longer just in her head. When Jide returned that evening, Said was waiting in the living room. The photo was open on her phone, her fingers clutching it tightly. "Jide," she called, her voice steady but laced with an edge that made him pause. "We need to talk." He sighed, loosening his tie. "What is it now, Said? I've had a long day." She rose from the couch and held out her phone. "Who is she?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Jide's expression darkened as he glanced at the screen. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "Stay out of my business, Said," he growled, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Your business?" she repeated, her voice rising. "What I've given you, 20 years of my life, my love, my trust, is none of my concern." Jide glared at her, his silence speaking volumes. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said finally, his voice cold. Said's chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. "I've stood by you through everything, Jide. I've raised your children, supported your dreams, and this is how you repay me." He scoffed and grabbed his car keys. "I don't have time for this," he muttered before storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty mansion, leaving Said standing alone in the living room, her shoulders slumped and her heart shattered. Slowly, she sank to the floor, her tears falling freely. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loneliness. The man she had built her life with, the man she had once adored, was a stranger. The perfect family she had worked so hard to create was nothing more than a facade. As the night stretched on, Said sat in the quiet house, her thoughts racing. The truth had been unveiled, but it left her with more questions than answers. Could she confront Jide again? Would he ever change? Or was it time for her to face a reality she had long tried to avoid? One thing was certain, her life would never be the same. While Said wrestled with the turmoil in her marriage, Ayo's life was unraveling in ways she couldn't control. The once bright and promising young man was now consumed by anger and resentment, much of it directed at his father. Jide's harsh criticism and impossible expectations had chipped away at Ayo's confidence, leaving him bitter and defiant. At first, his rebellion was subtle, staying out late with friends, skipping study sessions, and ignoring his chores. But as the weeks went on, his behavior escalated. Ayo began experimenting with alcohol, often coming home with bloodshot eyes and the faint smell of liquor on his breath. Said noticed the changes, but her attempts to reach out to him were met with cold resistance. "I'm fine, Mama," he would say whenever she tried to talk to him, his tone clipped and dismissive. "Just leave me alone." One evening, Ayo didn't come home at all. Said spent the night pacing the living room, her worry mounting with every passing hour. When the phone finally rang at dawn, her heart sank at the voice on the other end. "This is the police station," the officer said. "Your son has been involved in a brawl at a local bar. You need to come and pick him up." Said arrived at the station to find Ayo sitting on a wooden bench, his face bruised and his knuckles swollen. His once vibrant eyes were now dull and full of shame. She signed the release forms with trembling hands, her heart heavy with disappointment and worry. As they drove home in silence, Jide's anger exploded. "What kind of mother are you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't even control your own son. This is your fault, Said." Said bit her tongue, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She knew that arguing with Jide would only escalate the situation, but inside, she was seething. The weight of his words crushed her, adding to the guilt she already carried. In the back seat, Ayo stared out the window, his jaw clenched and his fists resting on his lap. He didn't say a word, but Said could feel the storm brewing within him. That night, Said sat alone in the kitchen, her head in her hands. She felt as though she were fighting a battle on all fronts, against her husband, her son, and her own doubts about her ability to hold her family together. The boy she had raised with so much love and care was slipping away, and she didn't know how to bring him back. Amid the chaos that engulfed the Adebanjo household, Tinny's quiet suffering went unnoticed. The youngest member of the family, Tenny had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to diffuse tensions with her gentle humor and bright smile. But as the arguments between Jide and Said grew louder, and Ayo's rebellion became more reckless, Tenny began to withdraw into herself. Her once excellent grades began to slip, and she stopped spending time with her friends. Said noticed the change but assumed it was a natural reaction to the stress in the house. She's a strong girl, Said told herself. She'll bounce back. But one afternoon, Said found Teeny sitting on the bathroom floor, her knees drawn to her chest and tears streaming down her face. Teeny? Said called softly, kneeling beside her daughter. What's wrong, my love? Teeny looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I can't do this anymore, Mama, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I feel like I'm drowning. I try to be strong, but I can't. Said's heart broke at her daughter's words. She pulled Teeny into her arms, holding her tightly as sobs racked the young girl's body. In that moment, Said realized how much her daughter had been carrying. Teeny, who had always been the glue holding their family together, was now falling apart. I'm so sorry, my baby, Said murmured, stroking Teeny's hair. I've been so caught up in everything else that I didn't see how much you've been hurting. But I'm here now. I'll do better, I promise. That night, as Teeny slept, Said sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She couldn't keep ignoring the cracks in her family. Her marriage might have been failing, but her children didn't deserve to be collateral damage. She needed to be stronger for Teeny, for Ayo, and for herself. The next morning, Said began taking steps to address the chaos in their lives. She reached out to a close friend who had experience with counseling, asking for recommendations. She also started researching family therapy options, determined to find a way to help her children heal. Said knew the road ahead would be difficult. Jide's pride and Ayo's anger would be obstacles, but she couldn't allow her family to fall apart any further. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. She would fight for her children, even if it meant standing up to Jide and confronting her own fears. As the sun set over the Adebanjo mansion that evening, Said sat by Teeny's bedside, watching her daughter's peaceful face as she slept. The storm within the family might have been far from over, but Said vowed to weather it, for the sake of her children and the love she still carried for them. The Adebanjo family was teetering on the edge of collapse. Said knew that if they didn't address the deeply ingrained toxic patterns, they would lose everything, each other, their sanity, and any hope for a future. Determined to save her family, she decided to confront Jide head-on. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Said sat across from Jide in their dimly lit living room. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of unspoken pain. Jide, she began, her voice steady but firm, this family cannot continue like this. I can't continue like this. We need help, or I'm leaving. Jide looked up sharply, his pride flickering in his eyes. What are you talking about, Said? I provided everything this family needs. You provided material things, yes, Said replied, her voice tinged with sadness. But what about love, respect, and emotional safety? Our children are suffering, Jide. I'm suffering. If you care about this family, you'll go to counseling with me. Jide scoffed, crossing his arms. Counseling? You want me to air my business to a stranger? Yes, Jide, Said said firmly, meeting his gaze. Because keeping it bottled up has only caused us pain. If you don't agree, I'll have no choice but to take Teeny and Ayo and leave. I won't let them grow up in a home filled with anger and fear. Her words struck a nerve. Jide sat in silence for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Fine, he said gruffly. But don't expect miracles. Their first counseling session was tense. Jide sat with his arms crossed, his body language screaming resistance, while Said opened up about the years of emotional neglect and the toll it had taken on her. The counselor gently encouraged Jide to share his feelings, but he resisted, deflecting questions with vague answers. It wasn't until the third session that Jide finally cracked. Do you know what it's like to carry the weight of everyone's expectations? He blurted out, his voice breaking. To feel like you have to be perfect all the time. Providing for this family, running a business, heaping up appearances, it's suffocating. Said stared at him, her heart softening despite her anger. Jide, she said quietly, we've all felt trapped in this house, but instead of talking to us, you shut us out. You lashed out. And now we're all broken. The sessions began to uncover layers of buried pain and resentment. Jide confessed that his infidelity was a misguided attempt to regain control of his life, a way to escape the pressure he felt at home. Said, in turn, admitted to sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of appearances, ignoring her needs to keep the family intact. When A was invited to join a session, his response was raw and heartbreaking. "You've never cared about what I wanted, Baba," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You only care about how I make you look. I've spent my whole life trying to be good enough for you, and it's never enough." Jaid's face crumpled as he listened to his son's words. For the first time, he saw the damage his actions had caused. "I'm sorry, Ayo," he said, his voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Teeny, too, found her voice during one of the sessions. With tears in her eyes, she expressed how invisible she had felt. "It's like I don't exist," she said softly. "No one notices me unless I'm in trouble. I just want us to be a family again." Hearing their children's pain broke something in Said and Jaid. For the first time, they saw the full extent of the harm they had inflicted, not just on each other but on Ayo and Teeny as well. It was a sobering realization, one that forced them to confront the need for real change. The road to healing was not linear, nor was it easy. Each member of the Adebanjo family had to face their own demons and take steps toward growth and reconciliation. Jaid, once resistant to counseling, began attending sessions regularly, both with Said and on his own. He cut ties with his mistress and focused on rebuilding trust within his family. Jaid also took small but significant steps to change his behavior. He made an effort to control his temper, listening instead of shouting when conflicts arose. He started spending more time with his children, asking Ayo about school and helping Teeny with her homework. These small gestures began to chip away at the walls his family had built around themselves. Said, meanwhile, rediscovered parts of herself she had long neglected. She joined a women's group in the community where she found support and inspiration. She picked up painting, a hobby she had abandoned years ago, and found solace in expressing her emotions through art. For the first time in years, Said felt like an individual, not just a wife and mother. Ayo, too, began to find his footing. At Said's insistence, he joined a local soccer team, where he found a mentor in the coach, a kind and understanding man who helped guide him through his anger and frustration. The sport became an outlet for Ayo's emotions, allowing him to channel his energy into something positive. Teeny, encouraged by her mother's strength, started therapy and began exploring her creative side. She discovered a love for poetry, filling notebooks with verses that expressed her hopes, fears, and dreams. With her mother's support, she began sharing her work at school events, gaining confidence in her voice. Though progress was slow, the Adebanjos started to rebuild their relationships. There were setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt, but there were also breakthroughs. Family dinners, once filled with tension, became opportunities for laughter and connection. Jaid's temper softened and his laughter became a more frequent sound in the house. Said radiated confidence, no longer shrinking under the weight of Jaid's criticism. Ayo and Teeny found stability, their sibling bond strengthening as they healed together. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Said looked around at the faces of her husband and children. The scars of their past remained, but they no longer defined them. They had come a long way, and though the journey was far from over, they were walking it together. Months later, the Adebanjos were not the same family they had once been. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged stronger, bound by love, honesty, and a shared commitment to change. Though the journey had been painful, it had brought them closer than ever before. Their story became a source of inspiration for their community. Said's women's group grew, offering support to other women in similar situations. Jaid began mentoring young men, teaching them the importance of vulnerability and emotional awareness. Ayo and Teeny, once caught in the storm of their family's dysfunction, found joy and purpose in their respective passions. One evening as they gathered for dinner, the atmosphere was light and filled with genuine warmth. Laughter echoed through the house, a testament to how far they had come. For the first time in years, Said felt at peace. Their family wasn't perfect, no family was, but they had found strength in unity. Together they had turned their pain into a story of resilience and hope.